6 million people in Asia between Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Arendt named the ability of ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil as a result of social pressure or within a certain social setting, the banality of evil. That was the subtitle of her book. The banality of evil was not unique to the Nazis. Just 3 months after the start of Eichmann's trial, a social psychologist at Yale University conducted a series of experiments to better understand the nature of obedience to authority. The results were shocking. Stanley Milgram, the Milgram experiments, carefully screened subjects to be participants in representing typical U.S. Americans. Briefed on the importance of following orders, they were instructed to press a lever, inflicting what they believed were gradually escalating series of shocks at 15-volt increments every time the nearby learner actor made a mistake in a word-matching task on the other side of a window. The experimenter, authority figure, calmly insisted that the experiment must continue, even when the learners began screaming in pain. A startling 65% of the participants administered the most dangerous level of electricity, a level that might have killed someone actually receiving the shocks. Additional experiments were conducted over the years at other universities in the U.S. and in at least 9 other countries. They all revealed similar high rates of compliance to authority. A 2008 study designed to replicate the Milgram obedience experience while avoiding several of its most controversial aspects found similar results. In his paper, Milgram announced the study's most fundamental lesson. Ordinary people, simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible, destructive process. The most common adjustment of thought in the obedient subject is for him to see himself as not responsible for his own actions. He sees himself not as a person acting in a morally accountable way, but as the agent of external authority doing one's duty. That was heard time and again in the defense statements of those accused at Nuremberg. In complex society, it is psychologically easy to ignore responsibility when one is only an intermediate link in a chain of evil action, but is far from the final consequences. Thus, there is a fragmentation of the total human act. No one man or woman decides to carry out the evil act and is confronted with its consequences. So I think this applies to virtually all of us in modern society to varying degrees. Milgram reminded us that a critical examination of our own history reveals a quote-unquote democracy of installed authority, no less tyrannical, thriving on an obedient population of insatiable consumers dependent upon the terrorization of others, citing destruction of the original indigenous inhabitants, dependence upon slavery of millions, internment of Japanese Americans, and the use of napalm against Vietnamese civilians. So the Milgram experiment, when I studied them, really had a huge impact on me because I realized that it's really easy to be doing really evil things, and all you're doing is your job, and you're actually being rewarded for doing your job. Nobody is really condemning you. And yet, the question I asked when I started writing this book was, how was it so easy for a good kid from upstate New York to obey a man's orders to go 9,000 miles away with a backpack and a weapon to destroy people in other culture? I mean, that is the question that really kept bugging me. And it was like, wow, it is so criminal. It's so absurd. It's so off the chart of anything that could be considered reasonable, yet it happens all the time, and it's been happening for a long time. But that was the question I asked when I started writing the book, and it was a question about where was my soul? Where is my soul? And so the book is basically this journey of discovering my soul, and in order to do that, I had to study the history of hominids and modern humans by studying anthropology, archaeology, evolutionary biology, Jungian psychology, lots of history. I wanted to know the history of the human condition and my condition and how the conditioning works generation after generation after generation after generation after generation, hundreds of generations, where we become so dehumanized that we don't really have a sense of the consequences of our actions. And so a lot of this book is about understanding consequences of our behavior, of our individual behavior and our collective behavior. And so a lot of my life after Vietnam really was to confirm my suspicions that the history of my country, that as I had been told, was pretty much a complete lie. And the myth of exceptionalism, I really wanted to get into that. It's just this exceptional culture that I was so happy to be part of when I was young. So because I'm law trained, I always needed, because of my insecurity as a person, I needed lots of evidence, cumulative evidence to make sure I'm kind of on the right track, that I'm reconfirming my suspicions that actually we've been out of our heads, out of our minds, for perhaps millenniums, and certainly in my society for 200 years. And I also knew that being an oppressor is really destructive to me as well as it is to the person that's being oppressed. It's really destructive to my own humanity. So I started having lots of experiences in other countries as well as traveling around the United States just to kind of study human behavior. I was never sponsored by anybody. I was just kind of doing this kind of on my own motivation. I had been sponsored by the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee in the 70s to study prison issues around the country. But after that, I was pretty much on my own, except when I worked for the state senate in Massachusetts. Now, 1986, I took my first trip to Nicaragua, my first of 30 trips to Nicaragua during the revolution. And I also went to El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala. And of course I was learning about the same patterns of protecting oligarchic structures at the expense of the vast numbers of people who were being exploited. And I think I'll just read one passage from one of the, and I will read one passage about the train, but I want to read one passage about one of the experiences in Nicaragua. In 1987, I helped organize a group of veterans, 11 veterans, to go to Nicaragua to spend time in the war zones. And part of that time, we walked through the most dangerous part of Jinotega, near the Honduran border. We walked for 75 miles in a week. We had backpacks, we had our own rice and beans. We went from day to day, walking single file on two sides of the road, two columns. We rehearsed what we would do if we were attacked by the Contras. We were unarmed, and we were committed to total nonviolent resistance, but we had to know how to respond rather than panic when we were attacked, if we were attacked. So at least we rehearsed it for a week before we went to Nicaragua as a group. So when we decided to do this walk, we had to get permission from the Nicaraguan government. And so we briefed the U.S. Embassy in Managua of our plans on March 20th. This was March 20th, 1987. We met not only with U.S. Ambassador Harry Burgold and his information officer, Alfred A. Lawn III, who not only informed us he had been a Phoenix operative in Vietnam, meaning an assassin, but warned us that if anything happened during our walk, we, the U.S., will hold the Sandinista government responsible. We were reassured to receive advance notice that no investigation would be held if anything happened to us, as the satanic Sandinistas would be automatically blamed. On Sunday afternoon, March 22nd, the day before the walk was to begin, we received a military briefing about watching for loose mounds of gravel on the road surface that might be concealing anti-tank mines and how to detonate them if necessary. We were to surround any suspected mine location with rocks. Later that evening, we received an intelligence briefing from the Sandinista military in Jinotega about locations of recent Contra sightings and attacks along this road, which of course made us very nervous. When we asked one of their officers, well-known Sandinista commander Omar Cabezas, what we might expect, he replied, "I think they're going to try to kill you." We paused, looked at one another,